The elderly man, Henry, stands at the counter, his heart racing with frustration. A small, unexpected fee had been deducted from his account, but it wasn't the amount that stung. It was the way he was being treated. The young teller, barely glancing at him, typed away with an air of indifference. Henry felt his pulse quicken as she tossed his receipt back without explanation. It wasn't the fee that made him feel small, but the dismissive way he was treated by people half his age, people who didn't see the years of hard work he had put into his life. For a man who had spent over 40 years teaching children about respect and fairness, this moment, being humiliated in a crowded bank, was almost unbearable. The hum of the crowded bank filled his ears. People were impatient, murmuring about the long wait. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the heat from the bustling crowd made his skin feel sticky. He felt invisible, like a forgotten relic from a past that didn't matter anymore. But as he stood there, a stranger entered the scene, a man who would remind him and everyone watching that no one's dignity should ever be dismissed. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at First Pacific Bank on Main Street. The line snaked out from the service counters and the air buzzed with impatience. A low murmur of complaints echoed throughout the building as the customers checked their watches, shifted from foot to foot, and grumbled under their breath. The bank was hot, stuffy, and overcrowded. The metallic hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed incessantly, matching the restless energy in the room. The faint clinking of coins and the tapping of pens echoed as tellers quickly moved between customers, trying to keep up with the endless stream of transactions. Henry had been standing in line for almost 20 minutes. His stiff back ached, and his arthritic knees throbbed with each passing minute. He glanced at his watch, frustration mounting. He hadn't expected a quick stop at the bank to turn into a test of his patience. The elderly man had always been a creature of habit. Every month, like clockwork, he came to check his account to ensure that his small pension was intact. Henry was a retired school teacher who had spent over 4 decades shaping the minds of young students. He'd dedicated his life to helping others learn, watching them grow into capable adults. Loyalty and integrity were the cornerstones of his existence. He had never been one to make waves or demand attention. He preferred to blend in, to be respectful and patient. But now, as he shuffled toward the counter, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest. He had always trusted First Pacific Bank. They had been his bank for decades. He had been loyal, dependable. The small fee on his account, barely enough to be noticed, didn't seem like much, but the fact that it was a mistake made it feel like a betrayal. As he approached the counter, Megan, the young teller, glanced up briefly before dismissively gesturing for him to hand over his paperwork. He quietly explained the mistake, but as he spoke, he felt the weight of the room bearing down on him. Megan's eyes remained focused on her computer screen, her fingers typing away, barely registering his presence. It was as if he didn't even exist. The noise of the room faded, replaced by a hollow thudding in his chest. The impatience of the other customers grew louder in his ears. He could feel the heat in the room as the line behind him seemed to stretch endlessly. His fingers gripped his receipt tightly, his knuckles whitening with the pressure. Henry was used to waiting, used to being patient, but something about this moment felt different. He wasn't just waiting for a resolution to a financial issue. He was waiting for someone to notice him, to treat him like he mattered. He had given decades of his life to teaching, helping young people grow, believing that the world was fair. Yet here he was, invisible in a crowded room, ignored and dismissed by the very people who were supposed to help him. This small fee, this mistake on his account had become more than just an inconvenience. It had become a reminder that sometimes people were quick to forget the value of those who came before them. But as the frustration began to rise in his chest, Henry didn't know that someone in the crowd had noticed. A stranger had seen the injustice unfold, and this man would soon step forward, unafraid, unshaken, to challenge the way the world treated people like Henry. Henry felt the heat in his cheeks rise as he stood in front of Megan, the young teller, his hands slightly shaking. This wasn't how he imagined this interaction would go. He had come here hoping for a quick fix, expecting the bank to resolve what he thought was just a small clerical error. But as he opened his mouth to explain, the words felt heavy, like stones in his throat. He was used to being patient, used to keeping his thoughts to himself, but something about this moment felt different. The way Megan barely glanced at him, her fingers dancing quickly over the keyboard as if he was just another number in a system, made him feel invisible. It was hard for him to even articulate the confusion running through his mind. I believe there's been a mistake with my account, he started, his voice a little shakier than he'd intended. I noticed some fees I don't remember ever seeing before. I've been banking here for years, and I've never had these charges. Megan didn't look up, not even once. Her eyes remained fixed on the computer screen as if she were too busy with her task to even acknowledge the elderly man standing in front of her. The sound of her fingers tapping on the keys was almost louder than his voice, filling the space between them like a wall. "That's just standard maintenance fees, sir," she replied flatly, the words coming out without a hint of empathy. "They're applied to accounts that don't meet the minimum balance requirements. You should have been notified about it." Henry swallowed hard, trying to keep his cool. He wasn't a man who liked confrontation, especially not at his age, but this felt wrong. He had always made sure his finances were in order. He had to, with his fixed pension. Every penny mattered to him, and he certainly never remembered seeing these fees before. His chest tightened with a growing sense of unease, but he pushed forward. "I've had this account for over 30 years, Henry said, his voice a little firmer now. "I've never seen these fees before. I keep track of my balance. This is new. I don't think this is right." Megan didn't even blink. She let out an exaggerated sigh, barely raising her eyes from her screen. "Well, if you didn't read the fine print, that's your fault," she said dismissively, her tone cold, bordering on rude. She shuffled through the papers in front of her, flipping through them with no sense of urgency or care, as if Henry's issue wasn't worth her time. Henry blinked, stunned by the lack of compassion. He felt a lump rise in his throat, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. He had trusted this bank for decades, had always done things by the book. And now, here he was, standing in front of this young woman, trying to explain a mistake that shouldn't have happened in the first place, only to be treated like he was the one at fault. He was starting to feel like an inconvenience, like someone who didn't matter. He tried again. "I just want to understand why this is happening. If something's changed in the system, shouldn't I have been notified?" He hesitated, feeling his patience wear thin, but he couldn't let it go. "I've worked hard for everything I have. I just want fairness. This isn't about the money. It's about trust." Megan gave him a glance, barely. "Look, if you want to avoid the fees, you need to keep a higher balance," she snapped, clearly annoyed. "That's how it works. If you don't like it, maybe you should look for a different bank." She didn't wait for his response before turning her attention back to her computer screen, leaving Henry feeling small, helpless, and completely disregarded. The words stung more than the fees ever could. Henry felt his hands trembling now. He wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but the room felt suddenly too hot. The other customers around him seemed to blend into the background, indifferent to his growing discomfort. He was on his own. And just as his frustration was about to spill over, Frank, the branch manager, appeared. His shoes clicked on the tile floor as he approached the counter with an air of authority. Henry's heart sank when he saw the look on Frank's face. Smug, indifferent, almost like he was prepared to dismiss Henry in the same way Megan had. Frank crossed his arms, his eyes gliding over Henry without a shred of warmth. "What's going on here?" he asked in a tone that was more commanding than concerned. Henry felt a knot form in his stomach, the oppressive weight of the situation pressing in on him. "I've been trying to explain that there's a fee on my account I didn't authorize," Henry said, his voice still shaky but determined. "I've been with this bank for over 30 years. I've always kept my account in good standing. I just want to understand why this is happening." Frank didn't even acknowledge Henry's years of loyalty. Instead, he turned to Megan, who nodded nonchalantly. Then, without looking at Henry, he said, "It's standard procedure. If you don't meet the balance requirements, you get charged. There's nothing to discuss." Henry felt his chest tighten. "But I've never had these fees before," he said again, his voice rising, his frustration bubbling over. "Something has changed. I just want someone to look into it." Frank smirked, clearly irritated. "Well, I can't help you if you don't understand how banking works," he said with a dismissive shrug. "Maybe you should have read the fine print. If you're not happy with the service, maybe you should find a new bank." The words hit like a slap in the face. Henry's mind raced, his pulse quickening with indignation. How was it that he had given this bank his trust for so many years, only to be treated like this now? The humiliation of it all, the way Megan had dismissed him, the way Frank had belittled him, it was more than just frustrating. It was degrading. But the worst part? No one was helping him. No one was on his side. It felt like the world had turned its back on him. As the seconds dragged on, the feeling of helplessness consumed him. And that's when it happened. A sudden shift in the air. A voice cut through the tension. A voice that would change everything. The air in the bank grew thicker with tension as Henry stood before Frank, his hands now gripping the edge of the counter, knuckles white with frustration. Frank's dismissive attitude was now clear in the way he barely made eye contact. The arrogance in his posture, arms crossed, leaning back slightly as if Henry's problem was an inconvenience to his day, only added fuel to the fire in Henry's chest. Every word Frank spoke felt like another jab, and Henry could feel his blood boiling, but his decades of patience held him in place. "You're telling me that these fees are standard," Henry said, his voice quieter than before but laced with a new determination. "But I've had this account for years, and I've never been charged like this before." His grip on the counter tightened. "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking for an explanation." Frank, clearly growing impatient, let out a quick, almost bored sigh. He glanced over Henry's head toward the line of customers growing longer behind him. The impatient murmur of people shifting in line was growing louder, and Henry felt his chest tighten again. It was as if Frank didn't even consider Henry's years of loyalty to be worth his attention. "Look, sir," Frank said slowly, as though Henry was the one who didn't understand. "You either meet the balance requirements or you don't. If you don't, then you get charged. It's all in the system." The word system sent a chill through Henry. It was the cold, impersonal response that made him feel even more invisible. Frank wasn't interested in explaining or empathizing. He was only interested in moving the line forward, and Henry was in his way. Henry could feel his resolve slipping. He wasn't used to standing up for himself like this. Throughout his life, he had done his best to be polite, to avoid conflict, to let the world move around him. But this was different. This wasn't just about the money. This was about respect. "I've been banking with this bank for over 30 years, Henry pressed, taking a step closer to the counter, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve to be treated like this." The words came out before he even realized it, and for the briefest moment he was taken aback by the emotion that surged through him. The weight of it all was unbearable. The years of hard work, the pension that barely covered his bills, and now, standing here, being dismissed by someone half his age. But before he could say more, Frank cut him off, his voice sharper now. "Frankly, sir, the way things are now, you don't quite fit our bank's modern image," he said with an air of finality, almost like a verdict. "You're going to need to keep up with the times if you want to avoid these fees." His eyes flicked over Henry, almost sizing him up like a relic of a bygone era. Henry froze. Modern image? The words echoed in his head like a slap. He wanted to argue, to speak up, but he felt himself faltering. Was this how people saw him now? Old, out of touch, irrelevant? He looked around at the other customers, hoping to find some sign that someone would speak up for him. The people behind him shuffled, their eyes casting downward, pretending not to notice. The murmurs of frustration from the growing line were barely a backdrop now. The customers seemed too busy with their own impatience to care about Henry's struggle. A middle-aged woman, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glanced at him for a second, just long enough for their eyes to meet. Her expression was sympathetic, but she quickly turned away as if afraid to get involved. Henry noticed a young man with a coffee cup in his hand, staring at his phone. He was the picture of disinterest, the epitome of modernity, just like Frank had mentioned. Henry's heart sank. It was like no one in the room cared, and he was left to fend for himself. Frank turned his attention back to the computer screen, completely ignoring the weight of Henry's words. "Look," he said, tapping the keyboard a little too forcefully. "If you don't like it, you can always find another bank. It's not like we're holding you hostage here." Those words landed like a punch in Henry's gut. Find another bank? After 30 years? Hadn't he earned something more than this callous treatment? He was shaking now, but not with anger. It was the sudden flood of memories. His late wife, Margaret, the way they'd sat together at the kitchen table late at night, balancing their modest finances, trusting each other, trusting the system. He thought about his old friends. Some still alive, some long gone, but all of them part of a world that felt like it had vanished. Where had that world gone? The world where loyalty meant something? The world where someone like him wasn't dismissed as if he was just a number? Henry could feel the sting of tears at the corner of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He wasn't going to cry here. Not in front of all these people. Not in front of Frank. "Listen, I'm not asking for anything more than what I've earned," he said, his voice trembling but firm. He leaned a little closer to Frank, locking eyes with him for the first time. "I've paid my dues. I don't deserve this kind of treatment. No one does." The silence between them was suffocating. But then, just as the words seemed to hang in the air, a deep voice suddenly cut through the tension. "Why are you talking to him like that?" David had entered the scene, quietly, almost unnoticed. He wasn't dressed in a suit or carrying an air of authority. He was just a man in jeans, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. But the calm authority in his voice demanded attention, and it seemed to instantly shift the mood in the room. Henry's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know who this man was, but in that moment, it felt like someone had finally heard him. He wasn't alone. As Henry stood there, the silence between him and Frank stretched longer and longer. Every word Frank had thrown at him, the cold dismissal, the sneers, the accusations, had dug deeper, each one landing harder than the last. Henry's hands trembled at his sides, his frustration mounting. He was fighting to keep it together, but each breath felt like it was becoming harder to take. The humiliation was too much. He wanted to shout. He wanted to scream. But what would it matter? Frank had already decided he was a relic of a past no one cared about. Frank had already written him off. In the midst of Frank's insufferable smirk, Henry's heart sank. He thought about the years of hard work, the loyalty he had given to a place he had trusted, the decades spent teaching young minds to care for one another. And now? Now he was just some inconvenience, just a small mistake to be brushed aside. But before Henry could fully give in to the suffocating weight of defeat, he felt a presence, a shift in the air. The sudden clarity in the room brought his attention back to the door. David stood there just inside the entrance, observing the scene with a calm, unwavering gaze. He was a stranger to Henry, but something about the way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his presence, made Henry feel like someone was finally listening. David stood still for a moment, his eyes taking in the scene before him. His gaze swept over Henry, the other customers, and then back to Frank. He took in the growing tension in the room, the discomfort in the air, the way the other customers had stopped moving, their eyes flicking nervously between the two men. Some were too afraid to say anything. Some were still waiting, their impatience still apparent, but now overshadowed by the thick weight of Henry's predicament. David looked around again, his expression not changing. He wasn't angry, he was calm, but the way he stood, unwavering, made Frank's dismissive attitude seem even more out of place. His next move was deliberate, slow, but sure. David stepped forward. "Why are you talking to him like that?" David's voice rang out, cutting through the room with surprising clarity. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was firm, direct, and most importantly, it was focused on what mattered. Frank froze, his face immediately morphing into one of irritation as he turned to the newcomer. For a moment, David was a stranger, a random man who had no reason to get involved. But the tone in his voice, calm, yet resolute, shattered the oppressive silence. "What did you say?" Frank's words were laced with irritation, his jaw clenched as he turned fully toward David. He looked the man up and down, clearly unimpressed by his lack of uniform, his casual demeanor. He dismissed him in a heartbeat as if he were an interruption, an outsider who didn't belong. David's eyes locked with Frank's. "I said, why are you treating him like this?" he repeated, his voice unwavering. There was no anger, no raised voice, just a deep, undeniable frustration with the way Henry was being treated. "He's been a loyal customer here for decades, and you're talking to him like he's disposable." The tension in the room grew. Some of the customers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. A middle-aged woman, her arms still crossed, shot a quick glance at David but quickly turned away. A young man near the back of the line, holding his phone in one hand, watched intently, the sense of discomfort on his face growing. David's words had a way of hanging in the air, forcing people to confront the truth they'd been ignoring, that this situation was wrong. Frank, already a man who thought he had control of the situation, scoffed. "Look, this is none of your business. We have policies, and you've clearly never had to deal with the reality of banking in this day and age." He tried to brush David off with a wave of his hand, but there was something about the calm in David's eyes that made him hesitate. David took a step forward, undeterred by the condescension. No, you don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice firm but even. "The problem here is that you've got people like Henry, who've worked hard their whole lives, who've trusted the system, and you're treating them like they're nothing, like they don't matter." The crowd in the bank had grown quieter, now fully aware that this wasn't a regular customer complaint. David's words hung in the air, charging the atmosphere with something much more meaningful than simple frustration. He wasn't just speaking to Frank anymore, he was speaking for everyone who had ever felt dismissed, ignored, or humiliated. "Henry doesn't deserve this," David continued, his voice rising slightly but never out of control. "What's happening here isn't just about some fees. It's about the way you've forgotten what respect is. And for people like you," he gestured toward Frank, "to treat someone like Henry as if his years of loyalty and hard work don't mean anything, that's the real problem." The room was electric. Eyes darted between David and Frank, some customers glancing at one another nervously. A few started to shift their weight from one foot to the other, glancing at Frank as if they were waiting for him to do something, to shut David down, to push him away, to put this man back in his place. But David didn't back down. "I'm going to say it again," David said, now speaking to the whole room. "What's happening here? This is wrong. Henry doesn't deserve this. No one does." His eyes swept over the other customers who were now fully involved in the exchange, even if they weren't speaking. "If you're tired of being treated like you don't matter, you have to stand up. Someone has to. And I'm here to tell you, this man deserves to be treated with respect, like every one of us does." For the first time that afternoon, Henry felt his heart lighten. He looked at David, standing there so sure of himself, so unafraid to speak the truth. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone had seen him. Someone had cared enough to speak up. But Frank wasn't going to let it go so easily. He sneered at David, trying to hold on to the illusion of control. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me how to do my job?" Frank's voice was mocking now, desperate to keep the upper hand. "You're just some customer. You're not going to change how things work here." But David stepped even closer, his voice dropping just a little, a soft, controlled edge to it. "The problem is, Frank," he said with a small knowing smile, "you don't know who you're dealing with. If you think this is just about policies, you're sorely mistaken. This is about people, real people, people who deserve to be treated with dignity." The bank was silent. No one moved, no one spoke. All eyes were on David and Frank, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. For the first time that day, the room was on edge. The room was still. The air that had been so thick with tension only moments ago now seemed to hang in a heavy silence. Frank stood frozen, staring at David, unsure of what to do next. The facade of authority he had so confidently held was crumbling under the weight of the truth that David had so boldly laid out. The crowd, once quiet and indifferent, now felt more connected, united even. Then, something unexpected happened. Frank looked over at Henry, his face tight, eyes shifting between the papers in front of him and the crowd that had begun to murmur quietly among themselves. The realization of what had just occurred settled in. With a deep sigh, Frank took a step forward, his posture stiff. Henry's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was he finally going to get the apology he deserved? "Look, Frank started, his voice a little quieter than before. "I apologize for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable." He seemed to choke on the words. It wasn't an apology that came easily, and Henry could see the irritation still bubbling under the surface. But it was an apology nonetheless. The moment hung in the air, and Henry could feel the weight of it, the relief flooding in like a burst of cool air after a storm. He'd never expected such an apology, not from someone like Frank. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Henry took a deep breath, his chest lifting as he tried to steady his emotions. "Thank you," Henry said, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for fixing this." He paused, looking around the room. The small interaction with David had changed everything. His confidence, which had been rattled only moments before, was beginning to return. The tension in the room started to break as well. David turned to leave, his job done. He didn't say another word, but Henry could feel the weight of the man's quiet strength. As David walked toward the exit, Henry couldn't help but feel a deep sense of appreciation for this stranger. David had restored something that Henry hadn't even realized he'd lost: his belief that standing up for what's right could make a difference. As David reached the door, he paused for a moment, turning back toward Henry. "Take care, man," he said simply, before stepping out of the bank and into the sunlight outside. Henry stood there for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. The sting of humiliation was still there, but it wasn't as sharp anymore. Something had shifted. His dignity had been restored, not just by the reversal of the fees, but by the way David had stood by him when no one else would. The atmosphere in the bank had completely changed. The customers who had once avoided eye contact were now exchanging looks, some nodding in agreement, others murmuring quietly about what had just unfolded. One older woman near the back, who had been glancing nervously at Henry throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up. "Good for you, sir," she said with a smile, her voice gentle but filled with sincerity. "It's nice to see someone stand up for what's right." A younger man, who had been texting on his phone earlier, now looked up, meeting Henry's eyes. "You were right to stand up," he said, his voice quieter but no less sincere. "It's easy to let stuff like this slide, but people shouldn't be treated that way." The conversation began to grow, bit by bit. One by one, the customers shared their frustrations with the bank, with how the system often treated those who couldn't afford to stand up for themselves. Some whispered about their own experiences with hidden fees. Others nodded in silent agreement. The shared frustration began to form a bond between them all, a moment of unity in the midst of an otherwise uncomfortable situation. Henry felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't just about the fees anymore. It wasn't even about the apology from Frank. What mattered was that for once someone had seen him, not as just another old man waiting in line, but as a person who deserved respect, who deserved to be heard. And through that, the entire room had witnessed something that couldn't be ignored: the power of standing up, even when it feels impossible. As Henry walked toward the exit, the weight of the day's events started to settle. He thought about his late wife, Margaret, and how she would have felt in this moment, how proud she would have been to see him stand up for himself. He thought about the years he had spent teaching others about fairness, about fighting for what was right. Margaret had always told him that no matter how old he got, he should never forget his worth. Now, more than ever, Henry understood that lesson. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't some relic of the past. He had a voice, and it mattered. In the end, the small moment of confrontation at the bank had become a larger lesson. A lesson about respect, dignity, and the importance of standing up for yourself, no matter your age. If you believe that standing up for what's right matters, hit that subscribe button. Share this story to remind others that no one deserves to be treated like they don't matter. Remember, your voice can make a difference.